Yes, my name is Tim Nielsen. I'm working at RISE, which is a Swedish food research institute. And as Antonio said, I will talk about sodium reduction in seafood. And he also mentioned the reason for wanting to reduce sodium in foods in general. It is because if we eat too much sodium, there is a risk that the blood pressure increases. And if you get high blood pressure, that increases the risk for several serious diseases, such as heart attacks and stroke, for instance. In most countries worldwide, and definitely here in Europe, the sodium consumption is way above the recommended levels. For instance, where I come from in Sweden, we eat about twice as much sodium as the recommendations. And this causes some problems for the public health. According to the World Health Organization, the two most effective lifestyle-related measures that can be taken in order to improve the public health is to quit smoking and to eat less sodium. I think most people are aware that it's not very good for you to smoke. Maybe not as many know that eating too much sodium can be almost as harmful. It's not quite up there with smoking, but it's not far off. Most of the sodium that we eat, it comes from sodium chloride, what we in everyday speech call salt. And salt is present in most foods, and it's added to most foods, and it is added for several different reasons. The most obvious one being to provide a salty taste, but it can also be used in order to prevent or inhibit microbial growth, and it can be used, for instance, for providing texture to different foods. So in theory, it would be pretty easy to reduce sodium. You just add less sodium chloride to the food, but that would cause some problems because you would, in many cases, end up with an inferior product. It wouldn't taste as well, wouldn't meet the consumer's expectations, and maybe even it could be not safe to eat because that's too less salt and the microbials grow. So it's some challenges associated with this, and in our task in Seafood Tomorrow, the aim of the work was to produce 2 seafood products where we had reduced the sodium content with at least 25%, and we wanted to do that without having any negative effects on the microbiological safety or on the sensory quality. So we wanted to make a product that was just as good as the original product, but with 25% less sodium. And we selected 2 model foods for these experiments. One was salmon pate and the other one was smoked salmon. And now I'm briefly going to tell you about the findings we did when doing these experiments for the 2 products. And I'll start with the salmon pate. The method we used for reducing sodium in the salmon pate was to replace some of the sodium chloride by another salt called Saltwell. A Saltwell, it's a natural salt that is made up of a combination of sodium chloride and potassium chloride. And it has approximately 35% lower sodium levels than common salt, so pure sodium chloride. So if we could use Saltwell instead of sodium chloride, we would reduce the sodium content. So what we did then was we produced this salmon pate with different degrees of salt substitution. We had salmon pate with the original recipe, which was using pure sodium chloride as the only salt. We made pates with just Saltwell, and we made pates with combinations of these 2 salts. And when we had done that, we carried out different analyses, microbiological analysis, sensory analysis, and chemical analysis of the samples. And just to show you the main results from this first study was we found out that it was possible to replace all the sodium chloride with Saltwell without any effects on the microbial growth. We had the same growth of the microorganisms if we had pure sodium chloride, if we had pure Saltwell, or if we had different combination. And that was a very encouraging result. because that meant we could replace as much sodium chloride as we wanted without risking the food not being safe. When we carried out the sensory analysis, we had a trained sensory panel that evaluated 12 different attributes in the samples. I don't know if you can see that on the picture here to the right, but there are 3 different samples here. There's a yellow line, a blue line, and a green line, and they represent 3 different samples with different mixtures of salt in there, and they are almost overlapping. We can only see very minor differences for a few of the attributes. So this was also very encouraging, because that meant that the products tasted almost the same, even when we replaced the sodium chloride with a Saltwell. So what we did then, we wanted to check this out also with normal consumers, not just with a sensory panel. So we carried out consumer tests. Oh, sorry, it was one picture too many. I'll try to. There you go. So we made 2 different samples, and we made the original samples with pure sodium chloride, and we made one sample where we had replaced 90% of the sodium chloride with Saltwell, corresponding to a reduction of 27% sodium. We sent these samples for consumer tests in 3 different countries, in Belgium, Hungary, and Italy. In each country, there were about 60 respondents, and they were asked to give scores for how much they liked the 2 samples and how much they were willing to pay for the 2 samples. And it was very good results there as well, because there were no statistically significant differences between the sodium-reduced sample and the reference samples, neither regarding the liking or the willingness to pay. And we had the same results in all the 3 countries. So that was very good. And the final thing to do was to see if this was economically viable. So we carried out an economic feasibility study, and it turned out then the production cost of the sodium-reduced salmon pate, it's slightly higher because Saltwell is more expensive than pure sodium chloride, but you use very little salt compared to all the other ingredients in the products, like salmon, for instance. So the estimated cost increase was very small, 0.34%, which is negligible. And you could also assume that if you can state that the product is more healthy, that the consumers would be willing to pay more for it. So even if it's a slight cost increase, I think that can be made up of this. So the conclusion was that the product was economically feasible, and in addition, for the product, if you look into a more bigger perspective, if we could reduce sodium, it would mean great economical savings because of reduced healthcare costs in society. So that would be beneficial from that point of view as well. So let's turn to the smoked salmon then, where we used another method. Well, it's similar in one way, because again, we replaced the sodium chloride, but this time we didn't use Saltwell. We used pure potassium chloride instead. So it's pretty similar, but it's another approach anyway. So what we did was we replaced some of the sodium chloride with potassium chloride during the salting process in a similar way, and then we carried out the same type of tests for this product as well. And here we found out that when we replaced 50% of the sodium chloride with potassium chloride, there were no differences in the microbial growth, which was good again. However, when we carried out the sensory analysis, we could reduce the sodium content with 28% without any major changes in the sensory attributes. But when we replaced 50% of the sodium chloride, it was possible to detect the bitterness in the samples. And this is often associated with potassium, which can have a metallic taste or a bitter taste. So we decided to go with the initial aim to reduce the sodium content with 25%, and then we produced samples that were aimed to be sent for consumer service as well in the 3 countries. However, we ran into some problems here due to it was bureaucratic trouble, absence of certificates, and it wasn't made easier by the situation in society at the moment. So we couldn't send these samples. So we had to do it in another way, and we sent pictures that the consumers looked at, and then they decided how much they were willing to pay for these products. Unfortunately, they couldn't taste them, obviously, since we couldn't send them there. So they couldn't say anything about the liking of the product, but they could say something about their willingness to pay. And in this study, we did it in 2 steps. First, they saw the pictures and made their evaluation, and then they were informed that one of the samples had less sodium, and they were asked again how much they were willing to pay. And then we got some interesting results, because when they knew that one of the samples had less sodium, they said that they were willing to pay more for that sample than the original one with more sodium in it. And we saw the same results in 3 countries here as well. Again, we did an economic feasibility study, and again, it was a very small cost increase in the production, 0.62% in this case, but we had the same conclusions here. This product is economically viable, and it would work to put that onto the market. So that's what I'd like to present. I thank you for that. And just to conclude, I'd like to say that we met our aim to produce 2 seafood products with 25% less sodium without any negative effects on the quality or the safety of the products. Thank you.